watching Shalom TV, celebrating Jewish culture. Funding for Shalom TV has been provided by the following. And by viewers like you.
Jewish Education in Media is pleased to present L'Chaim, a program that highlights the people, issues, and events of importance to the Jewish community. Now here is your host, Rabbi Mark Golub.
I'm Mark Golub, and what would Jewish life be without a family controversy? And the latest family to-do in the Jewish community erupted suddenly when the Israeli Ministry of Absorption, the government agency which deals with aliyah, immigration to Israel, put a series of short videos up on YouTube directed at Israelis who are currently living in the United States. You may or may not be aware that there is a substantial number of Israelis, many of them young Israelis, who are choosing to leave Israel to create lives for themselves in America. In fact, the Ministry of Absorption estimates there are at least 400,000 Israelis living in the United States. That number is debated, it's questioned, but roughly Israel thinks there are 400 to 600,000 Israelis living here. These Israelis are called somewhat pejoratively Yordim, which means those who have descended from Israel, as opposed to those who make aliyah, which means to ascend to live in the state of Israel. And it should be a surprise to no one that the state of Israel would rather not lose its young people or any of its citizens, which is why the Ministry of Absorption decided to initiate a campaign on YouTube, which would tend to reach younger Israelis. And it's the nature and content of those YouTube videos which has created such a stir. In case you haven't seen them, let me show you a couple of them now. Here's the first one. Just watch.
Oh, now I understand why I didn't want to go to the party. Music, candles. Why don't we just stay home tonight? Daphna? What is this?
הם תמיד יישארו ישראלים. בני הזוג שלהם לא תמיד יבינו מה זה אומר. עזרו להם לחזור לארץ. למידע על סל ההטבות ייכנסו לאתר משרד הקליטה.
In essence, that video shows a young Israeli woman named Daphna coming into her New York apartment, trailed by her boyfriend, who I guess is Jewish, though it's not clear to me whether he is or not. And the boyfriend thinks that the candle and music in Daphna's apartment are a suggestion of a romantic evening. What the boyfriend does not realize, even when he sees the Hebrew word yizkor up on the computer, yizkor being the word that refers to the Jewish memorial service, is that Daphna is somehow memorializing an immediate relative, and that her somber mood reflects her thinking about a parent or a sibling whom she has lost. And obviously he does not understand that the candle burning there is a Yortzeit candle, a candle that burns for 24 hours on the anniversary of a loved one's passing. And the Hebrew text that comes up at the end of the video says, "They will always remain Israeli." They referring to Daphna and other Israelis living in America. But the second line of Hebrew says, this couple's children will not understand what it says. What it says referring to the Hebrew word yizkor on the computer screen and to the meaning of the Yortzeit candle as a memorial candle. And the final line of the video says, help them return to Israel, referring, of course, to Israelis now living in America and the fact that they should be somehow encouraged to and helped to return to Israel. So now watch this video one more time.
Oh, now I understand why you didn't want to go to the party. Music, candles. Why don't we just stay home tonight? Daphna? What is this?
הם תמיד יישארו ישראלים. בני הזוג שלהם לא תמיד יבינו מה זה אומר. עזרו להם לחזור לארץ. למידע על סל ההטבות ייכנסו לאתר משרד הקליטה.
That's one of the videos. Here's a second video in which you'll see two Israeli grandparents Skyping on their computer with their granddaughter in America. And the grandparents ask the granddaughter if she knows what holiday it is. And the granddaughter happily responds, "It's Christmas." And the Hebrew at the end of the video says, they, again meaning the Israeli parent, will always remain Israeli, but their children will not. And again, the final line of the video says, "Help them return to Israel," referring to Israelis now living in America. Here then is the second video for you to watch.
סבא בא איתי לחוג ריקוד, וכל הזמן הוא דורך לי על הרגל. ונועלה, מה שלומך?
בסדר.
ואיזה חג היום, את יודעת?
Christmas.
הם תמיד יישארו ישראלים. הילדים שלהם לא. עזרו להם לחזור לארץ. למידע על סל ההטבות ייכנסו לאתר משרד הקליטה.
Now those two videos have created quite a flap within American Jewry after Atlantic magazine columnist Jeffrey Goldberg brought them to public attention, arguing that they showed contempt for American Jewry. And within a day or so, Jewish organizations expressed outrage at this Israeli campaign on the grounds that it would try to convince Israelis in America to return to Israel based on the fact that American Jewry is not sufficiently or adequately or authentically Jewish. Prime Minister Netanyahu took the stand that he did not know of the campaign, and once it was brought to his attention, he had the YouTube ads taken down. But the statement had been made already. And the question now is, what does this Israeli attitude really mean? What does it reflect about Israeli attitudes towards American Jewry? How egregious was this YouTube video? Was there overreaction by American Jewish leaders? Or was their response completely justified? Well, for opinion on this matter, I'm very pleased to be joined by four individuals who each bring a special perspective to the discussion. Dr. Steven Bayme is director of the American Jewish Committee's Contemporary Jewish Life Department and the Koppelman Institute on American Jewish-Israeli Relations. And Steve's responsibilities include Jewish family issues, Jewish education, and Israel-diaspora relations. Rabbi Pesach Lerner is Executive Vice President of the National Council of Young Israel, based here in New York, which represents Orthodox shuls and communities throughout North America. Rabbi Julie Schonfeld is Executive Vice President of the conservative movement's rabbinical organization, the Rabbinical Assembly. And Julie has just written a piece on this subject for the Israeli newspaper, Haaretz. And we're joined by our own Sivan Hadari, founding president of Isramerica, a cultural organization that features emerging Israeli and Jewish American artists who are inspired by leading a Jewish-Israeli American lifestyle, and through art to spread a positive image of Israel to a vast audience of Jews and non-Jews alike. And Sivan typifies the Israeli whom these ads were meant to reach. And I want to welcome all of you and thank you so much for joining me for this discussion. It's good to have you back. Good to have you back. Always good to be with you. Sivan, what a kick to have you on the panel. Thank you. Sivan, I want to begin with you because, as I say, this ad in some way is directed at Israelis roughly your age who are not yet married, and it's suggesting in some way that you will be compromising and losing and giving something up by staying here in America and perhaps ending up marrying an American Jew and creating an American Jewish lifestyle. What was your reaction when you saw this ad?
Well, first of all, Mark, I'm very excited to be here. And this really is a subject that's dear to my heart. Being an American Israeli citizen of both countries, when I saw the ads, I was a little distraught. I was very distraught, actually. I even sent out an email blast and posted about it, and a lot of people were responding. A lot of other Israeli Americans or Israelis and American Jews were affected by it.
What bothered you most?
What bothered me is, on a personal level, I am an Isramerican. I'm Israeli and American. I was born here in New York, in Brooklyn, to Israeli parents. And I am probably as Israeli as it gets. And, you know,
But you should tell our audience, you actually did, you began your acting career, and you're an accomplished actress. You did a one-woman show here in America. Correct. You were also part of a very prestigious acting school and organization in Israel, correct?
Correct.
Named?
I lived half of my life in America and half of my life in Israel. I studied at the Bet Tzvi Conservatory, which is one of the most prestigious schools for performing arts in Israel. And when I came back to America, to New York, I also studied at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts. So,
two great schools.
Yes. So I am really immersed in both cultures. And what actually made me distraught is the fact that it's really unbelievable to me why it's okay to be African American or Asian American, but being Israeli American is wrong and dirty. And I think that the Israeli government and the American government need to come to grips with the fact that there is Israeli American culture. And instead of suppressing it or trying to point fingers or say this is wrong or you're not Israeli or you're not American, we should be trying to bridge the gap between both of our communities and saying, you know, what are the things that make us similar? What are the things that connect us to our love of Israel? And that's exactly what I'm trying to do with Isramerica, is say there is something called Israeli American culture, and we should celebrate it.
I am so anxious to hear what you have to say. First of all, you and I have talked many times about the problems of Jewish identity in general. The area of Israeli-American relationship is something you deal with all the time. You hear what Sivan has to say. I'm interested in two things from you. Number one, what was your initial reaction to the ad? And as you hear Sivan speak, does it spark any ideas for you?
No, thanks, Mark. Look, as far as initial reaction goes, I automatically assumed this was a lot of bureaucratic bungling, that it simply was not done well, it was not given any thought to it. There was no sense of sensitivity as to how this would be heard and seen by American Jews. If you're going to discuss assimilation in the United States, and the Israelis should, as should American Jews, you need to put it in a much more nuanced context, that there are pockets of assimilation accompanied by pockets of renewal. I have a lot of fears about assimilation. I've got a lot of hopes of renewal. This ad was unnuanced in that sense. Secondly, the almost direct implication, don't marry American Jews, because that's what will happen if you do. Well, again, I bristle at it because, as I think I said in the New York Times, we're one Jewish people. We should be about encouraging marriage between Jews. And those groups within the Jewish community that say, I don't want to have anything to do with you, I'd rather marry a Gentile than marry a Jew, that's a real problem. So in that sense, I thought the ads were very poorly done. They were given very little thought. Now, Sivan does raise the important question of what about Israelis in America, and what about their distinctive ethos, culture, identity? Generally speaking, our experience has been as follows, is that those Israelis that want to play an active role in Jewish communal life, such as on the staff of the American Jewish Committee, are tremendous assets in terms of really two ways. Number one, bridge building, which is what Sivan was talking about. And number two, they provide simply a perspective that we as an organization deeply involved with Israel need to hear. So in that sense, frankly, one of the things I think was disappointing about the ad series is that there's been a remarkable change in Israeli language towards Israelis living abroad over the last 30 years.
How would you characterize it?
Well, the late Prime Minister Rabin, of sainted memory, if you will, but during his first term, 1974 to 76, he referred to them as Mefagrei Eretz, the fallen of the land. Well, there's been a tremendous retreat from that. There's been much more of a language of positive identity, of Israelis living abroad should be seen as assets for the Jewish people and assets for the state of Israel. Obviously, the hope that they would return is perfectly legitimate, and that should be underscored. But there had been this change of language. Now, suddenly, the language of negativity was put back into this ad without giving any thought as to either what its impact would be on people like Sivan, or what its impact would be on people like myself who are trying to strengthen Jewish life in the United States.
Okay. In all fairness, there was no specific negative language used in the ad. You're talking about the mood and the message of the ad.
Absolutely. It was an indictment of American Jewry.
Okay. Julie, you have written a piece that just appeared as we're taping. It happens to be appearing today in Haaretz, and you took a slightly different tact. But I want first to know, when you saw the ad, here you are, one of the leaders of non-Orthodox Jewry in America. What was your reaction to the ad?
My reaction to the ad is that this is about Israelis speaking not only to Israeli expats in America, but I imagine that they are speaking to the Imas and Abbas back at home, right, hoping that they will guilt their sons and daughters in the United States into bringing the family back to Israel. That's my first observation. What struck me the most strongly is at the end when it says they will be Israeli, the children will not, is the conflation of terms, right? When are we talking about being Israeli and when are we talking about being Jewish?
Yes.
Right? That is what the ad was about. What is so stunning to me in all of this, I think that the American Jewish community has read this entirely wrong. I think there's nothing to be angry about, right? I think that this is about a very internal issue for Israel, a very powerful one, a very concerning one, right? When we look at that little girl, right? That little girl, by the way, this is the continuity crisis. This is a new writing of the post-1990 Jewish population study, right? What was that about? Will you have Jewish grandchildren? There's Saba and Safta's Jewish granddaughter sitting astride her Ima's lap, saying, what holiday is it? Christmas, right? It's a new writing of the same question.
You said this is not an ad that you think should make American Jews angry.
No, I think this is about whether Jewish identity is strong enough in Israelis, right, Jewish identity, such that when they are living in diaspora, right, and therefore need to connect to world Jews through their Jewish identity rather than through this holistic thing called Israeli identity, whether that identity is strong enough. This is the conversion crisis. This is every time we've been clashing, right?
Yes. You know, it's in one of the questions the ad does not answer. It only suggests. This Israeli, the Daphne, chose to date the guy who came through the door, who, by the way, in my mind is not clear whether he's Jewish or not Jewish.
It's not clear at all.
But Daphne made that choice. One of the things the ad doesn't ask is, what is Daphne doing with that guy who hasn't a clue what a yahrzeit candle is? But hold on. I want to hear what you have to say. What was your reaction when you saw the ad?
Well, the reaction was twofold. Number one, as was said before, Steve, that it's a little khaki. It's coming up with a message that I'm not sure was done properly, professionally, the sensitivity. But it hit me right away was the problem it's talking about. And there is a problem there, right? There is a problem there when the child is talking about Christmas rather than Hanukkah. It's a message. Now, I don't know whether this is Jewish identity or Israeli identity. They're the same, they're different. But there is a problem, and I think, if nothing more, and I doubt very much if this was their intention, that got everybody talking about Jewish and Israeli identity. The ads, it's hard for me to relate on a personal level, because I'm here, I'm American. I do have Sabra grandchildren here and there, but the point is, though, that I think it's an educational issue, identity issue, a continuity issue. But the point is, there is an issue. I would have loved just to see the rest of the tape. Obviously, it wasn't there, of what happened to Daphne and her husband or boyfriend afterwards. What was the next part of the conversation?
Of course.
There was an opportunity lost.
There
was an opportunity lost. That they could have framed it in a different discussion. Or the next could be, make sure that there's an education, make sure there's continuity, make sure that things are going on.
These ads were directed at my demographic, but also at parents and grandparents of. Julie is correct. The pressure was directed in both ways. Come back home to Israel. This is the only way you will be Israeli is in Israel. That was the point.
Is that true?
Of course not. I'm living proof that it's not.
Is that true? Is it true that it's hard to be Israeli if you don't live in Israel?
What our research has demonstrated, I think repeatedly, is really two things. Number one is that the encounter with American Jews actually enhances the Jewishness of Israelis. Nothing else, the issue Julie raises about choices. That's an important message, and it really needs to be underscored that, yes, American Jewish life does contain a number of choices, some of which you may find quite attractive, if nothing else, an alternative to the chief rabbinate. I think there's a second message, and that is, which is, I think, what really disturbed me about the ads, is that by underscoring this theme of Israeliness, there was no theme of Jewish peoplehood. Yom HaZikaron should mean as much, frankly, to American Jews as it does to Israelis.
Although it does not.
It does not, and that's a problem. They should challenge us and say, how is it that your people don't know about Yom HaZikaron?
But wait, I'm going to bet that many of our audience watching right now do not know what Yom HaZikaron is and have no clue when it occurs.
Without question, look, Aleph Bet Yoshua, in a widely critiqued appearance for the American Jewish Committee a number of years ago that I actually arranged, he launched a bomb by saying before his audience that you're all celebrating American Jewish life. How is it that no one here knows that we just completed Yom HaZikaron in Israel?
And you should identify. Yom HaZikaron is?
Well, it's a Remembrance Day for those who fell in the War of Independence.
And it occurs when?
Day before Yom Ha'atzmaut.
And how is it celebrated in Israel?
2 minutes of silence.
Everywhere, throughout the land.
Right. Okay.
Basically, the state of Israel comes to a stop. The entire nation stands for 2 minutes in silence, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, for 2 minutes in solidarity with those who died. By the way, is it limited only to those who died in the War of Independence, or now is it really the equivalent of a kind of a Memorial Day, Veterans Day?
Memorial Day.
Yes. It's really for any soldier who's died defending the state of Israel. And American Jews don't know about it. I would imagine in day schools they do. Am I correct?
Many day schools do, but I would go one step further. Let's go the next day. I don't think enough American Jews appreciate Yom Ha'atzmaut, appreciate the relevance, the importance of Yom Ha'atzmaut.
But
I must tell you, by the way, I spent 13 years in one of the finest of Jewish day schools. We all knew about Yom Ha'atzmaut. We did not know about Yom HaZikaron.
I agree. Okay. I want to say this, and I want all of you then to respond. I found the ad to be, in many ways, honest. I don't know what would happen to you if you married an American Jew and lived your life in America, visited family in Israel, but raised your children in an American school steeped in American, and let's say even American Jewish culture, whether your children would have the love of the state of Israel that you have. And I know what you mean. I know you. And I know how Israel pulsates through your being. I don't know if that would be true for your children. And I don't find that a lie. And the problem that this ad touches on, it's really what you were getting to also, and Julie too, is that if a Jew marries somebody who has no Jewish feeling, or marries somebody who isn't Jewish who has no Jewish feeling, the chances of the next generation having a Jewish feeling, a Jewish connection, is simply more difficult. Doesn't mean it can't happen, but it's more difficult. This ad was saying to you that if Israelis come to America, live here, the likelihood of the next generation feeling Israeli as opposed to American Jew, not Isramerica, but America, is very problematic. And that if I'm the state of Israel, I would like to say to you, if it matters to you, give it consideration. And that's what I think the ad was trying to say, even though I agree with all of you, it did it very poorly. But if that is the message, Sivan, do you want your children to have a feeling for Israel? Then shouldn't you at least give thought to the fact that marrying an American Jew and living here will make that more difficult for you and your children?
There is a point in this message, but the message should be, let's educate our children. That should be the message. The message should be, the way I was raised. Don't send your children to public school. Send them to a Jewish school. Send them to a Hebrew school. Talk to them about the holidays. Take them to Israel. Have them connected to organizations that take them to Israel and explain about Israeli identity. Not only about Judaism, about what our connection to Israel is. And like I said, I am living proof. It's true that both of my parents are Israeli, but I did go to a yeshiva where we spoke English, and it was very important to maintain that Israeli identity, to visit Israel, to celebrate the holidays, to get that connection to the land as well. So the point really should be, let's, as a community and also as American Jews, preserve that Israeli identity and not look it over. But the way it was said, I felt, was very low.
But I'm wondering, Sivan, if you really are the case study being discussed here, right? And if your personal experience, and by the way, first also to say, not for me to speak, you are the exclusive spokesperson for your experience and your perception. But I just observed that because of this combination of having lived, I don't know how many years you lived here in the U.S. and how many years in Israel, but that is slightly different than I think the group that's being spoken to are people who are born and raised in Israel. That's their education. That's their primary identity. They come to the United States as expats, set up households here. And I think that therein lies the difference. I do feel very strongly that what's happening here and what's the fascinating discussion is this conflation of identities. What is Jewish identity? What is Israeli identity? Even looking at religious identity, if you will, a bit more broadly, right? Taking the Kaplaninian religious civilization model, as you said, that there are those who, practice Jewish religious signifiers as part of a larger cultural identity. But what happens here in this video is that they are suggesting that the Israeli identity cannot be lived in the U.S. I don't know why one would think that it should, right? If I as an American go and live in France and my children are born there and they are the French children of American Jews, but let's leave aside that piece. In the next generation, they will be French, right? They will be French. So to me, that's Muvan Me'alav. There's nothing to discuss there. The question is, will they be Jewish? And to me, the absence of that from the video, from the discussion that it concludes with will they be Israeli rather than will they be Jewish, shows that the creators of the ad have no imagination for what we know for thousands of years as a diaspora Jewish identity, right? It's almost as if it's like the ancient maps. You leave Israel, you fall off the cliff, right? There's just oblivion. And they say, will they be Israeli? Because they don't have those words. And my response, right, where I really sort of felt like I saw something familiar, is the struggle. And it's such a powerful struggle. It's such an important struggle for Israelis and diaspora Jews to have a common ground on which to speak. Because it's, again, this very frequent experience of speaking to Israeli leadership and really feeling that they simply don't have, not in a hostile way, right, but they don't have an imagination for what is the experience, the identity of our entire population here in the United States.
I think it's simple, and I think I have to differentiate between the Israeli, however you qualify them, who's living in a Jewish community. You're living in New York, you grew up in Brooklyn. Let's find the Israeli who's in Timbuktu. Let's find the Israeli communities that are out there that are not part of a synagogue, as was mentioned, not part of a community, right, who come at any point of their career, education, they plop themselves down in anywhere USA, they become part of whatever it is, they marry a Jew or a non-Jew. They don't have that ability to continue, forget about their kids. They don't have that ability to continue on their own because they don't have they're not part of the Jewish infrastructure that we are all lucky to be part of and live in. So there's a lot of communities out there, a lot of communities around college campuses, around business centers, that you have a bunch of Israelis who have nothing to do with whatever we call it, Israeli, Judaism, or whatever word that is. And perhaps the ad was referencing or focusing on some of the people who don't have that. Obviously, if this child was going to any type of day school, she would have been naturally answered Hanukkah.
Yes.
It wouldn't have come as a surprise to the parent, to the mother, who obviously was shocked. So I don't know whether that ad was focused. And again, I'm not saying the ad was perfect. I agree with much of the critique that was given. But I think perhaps maybe it's geared for that Israeli who needs to be woken up and the shock treatment and say, hey, wait a minute, where am I? What will I do? Have I thought out the future? My children or grandchildren or myself, where I'm going to be in the future. So the fact that it's, again, they're discussing it, I think the question has to be here is where as we as the organized Jewish community can go out there and say, okay, can we do, I hate the word outreach, but can we somehow find some of these communities and offer them the opportunities that exist in America for the greater Israeli Jewish entity?
There are serious issues between American Jewry and Israel. We don't have much of a dialogue between us. The quality of the dialogue that does exist, frankly, is quite minimal. And in that sense, I think, yes, it was a missed opportunity, that there is a need for Israelis to talk about American Jewry, talk about its relationship to American Jewry. The late Charles Liebman of Bar-Ilan University was one of my mentors. He used to say, Israelis like to talk about assimilation in the United States because it makes them feel good. American Jews like to talk about the absence of religious pluralism in Israel because it makes them feel good. Well, at least that's a basis for discussion of what are the weaknesses in both of us.
On Hanukkah, when you were in Israel, did you have potato pancakes, do you have latkes, or you have sifganayot?
Both.
In Israel, you had both?
Yes.
And what do you have here?
Both.
Okay. You understand that for most American Jews, it's not jelly donuts that we eat on Hanukkah. You understand that?
No.
You
Tell
didn't
me
know
about
that?
it.
Okay.
What do you have?
Okay. If it turns out that your kids only ate potato pancakes on Hanukkah, would it bother you at all?
No.
Okay.
I just want them to eat. I'm Jewish.
Okay.
They should eat
I
something.
understand. But the point I'm trying to make is that
it's
there
American.
are cultural differences between Israeli Jews and American Jews.
But it's both
and
Hanukkah.
what this ad was trying to say was, and again, I'm coming back to Julie's point, which is, I think, why the ad was such a failure, was that it conflated two issues that were not meant to be confused. You can be a Jew in America. It's hard enough to be a Jew anywhere. And many people feel Israelis are not doing a good enough job about being Jewish. That speaking Hebrew doesn't make one a Jew. Even living Ba'aretz doesn't make one ipso facto a Jew.
I agree.
Okay, and the question becomes, what do you do in your life to be Jewish? This ad was saying to the Israeli, irrespective of Judaism, we want you to be Israeli. We want you to have a feeling of what the IDF is and what Yom HaZikaron is. That has nothing to do with what you eat on Hanukkah or whether you ever go to Friday night services, Saturday morning services, or Shavuot morning services. We want you to be Israeli. But the ad expressed it. The ad could have been done by the AJC. You would not have put out as bad an ad. But it could have been done about what do Jewish parents and grandparents in America want for their Jewish children. The question of assimilation was what this ad was dealing with, not about Israeli identity.
I think though that, again, I'm not disagreeing on the lack of sensitivity on the ad. I think we're past that for the moment. But sometimes, and it's hard for all of us to really perhaps put ourselves in the viewer's seat, because I don't think it was geared for anybody here, yourself included. I think it was geared for that Israeli who needs a shock treatment and say, wait a second, where am I? I have forgotten about Hanukkah. Have I forgotten about the sensitivities? So I don't know that it was religious, Israeli. It was something that these people could and should relate to, whether you eat sufganiyot or you eat potato lot, because the bottom line is that the amount of sufganiyot, jelly donuts, sold in Israel on Hanukkah is astronomical.
Exactly right.
Not only
Okay.
in Jerusalem, it's bought by everybody, because everybody relates to some type of connection with the sufganiyot.
Okay. I was not offended by the ad at all. I didn't think it was effective. It did not offend me at all. I think Israel has every right to say to Israelis living in America, would you consider coming back to Israel? What offended me, or what concerned me, was this was an ad about assimilation. And it's as true for American grandparents and parents as it is for Israelis. And the issues that we saw depicted were, what are our children going to be? You deal with parents who have the issue of what a grandchild says in the December season all the time. You have it all the time. But even you have it all the time now. The question of assimilation affects the entire Jewish world. And so, although it came from Israel, as Jeff Goldberg wrote, why didn't it say to the Israeli, you know, the economy is doing a lot better in Israel than it is in America, why don't you come back?
Exactly.
But they chose a Judaism message, which I felt was not really relevant to the Israeli, and was much more relevant to those of us who are concerned with the American Jewish future.
My response is that it is perfectly legitimate and desirable that Jews everywhere, both in America and Israel, talk about assimilation in the United States.
Yes.
And frankly, one of the problems we have, around tables like this and elsewhere in the community is that it's very difficult to articulate the language of counter-assimilation without giving offense to people.
Right.
Intermarriage is becoming a taboo word, by the way. In other words, that unless you want to say it's an opportunity rather than a problem. So that it's perfectly legitimate to critique American Jewry and critique American Jewish leadership for an inability to foment or nurture a constructive discussion about assimilation and how to combat it. However, that said, number one is that you need to couch that discussion in the context that the overall picture of American Jewry is much more nuanced. That
those ads showed.
Exactly.
Yes.
But oftentimes within Israeli culture, the image of American Jewry is that, yes, it's the Christmas tree, or it's the priest and the rabbi who are co-officiating in a mixed marriage, which is quite rare. But that's the images that actually get picked up. The Christmas tree, frankly, has disappeared from the two-parent Jewish home, by the way. In the 1950s, it was very, very common. The Hanukkah bush, by and large, has disappeared. So in that sense, anyone looking at American Jewry, it requires a sense of fairness that says it's a dual narrative. It's a narrative of, yes, American Jews have a serious issue with assimilation. There are American Jews in community after community around the country who are also far more Jewishly involved than their parents and grandparents ever would have imagined. Those two stories coexist. And to state one without the other is either to inhabit a dream world, as if assimilation doesn't exist, or it's this kind of triumphalism that you're doomed to disappear. So in that respect, I think the ad was very ill-placed. If it was directed at American Jews, to the extent that it was, I think it was very poorly placed. If it was directed at Israelis, it's a miserable failure.
Again, I still hold, others may disagree, right? That part of what I felt and saw here was this way in which Israelis don't identify with viscerally, right, a diaspora Jewish identity, just don't have an imagination for it, right? And so to then begin to have that imagination for something that is not a diaspora Jewish identity, but an identity that we all share, right? And that I, as an American Jew, and you as an Israeli, and someone else as not as an Isra-American, but who has never come to the United States, that there's something that transcends all of that, right? Going back thousands of years, that is this shared Jewish identity that is portable, that is flexible, right? That continues to have in this global society its many iterations that we so desperately need. Because it's not a coincidence that American Jews keep getting insulted, right? And someone in Israel keeps saying, oh, we didn't mean any insult, right? We need to get beyond that. We need to figure out it's not about insult. for sure, it's not about anybody consciously trying to hurt or insult us. That is surely not the government's intention, but we're going like this. And we better stop going like this, right? Again, I hold that this is a profound security issue for Israel and the Jewish people. We need to get back like this.
By the way, does anyone here have any objection to Israel wanting to say to Israelis, come home? Does Israel have the right to say to Israelis?
Yes. Yes.
It does.
Yes.
So it doesn't. That doesn't offend you.
But there's a way to say it.
If the message simply was, Sivan, we really would love every Israeli who is a Sabra, who's now living in some other country, come back and live in Israel.
Yes, but let's do it in a positive way.
Okay.
I've been
Does it
studying
offend-
marketing since I was 15 years old, and guilt doesn't work.
Okay, by the way, did it make you feel guilty?
No, it made me feel upset.
Okay. Would it have bothered you? Would the message bother
Would not
you?
have bothered me. Way back in 1950, very early years of Israel, David Ben-Gurion sent out emissaries here, shlichim, who basically spoke a language of aliyah to American Jews. We know Israelis living here then. He spoke a language of aliyah, of come to Israel because anti-Semitism will shortly permeate the United States. The then head of the American Jewish Committee, Judge Proskauer, and Jacob Blaustein met with him and said, we understand your desire to articulate a language of aliyah. You wouldn't be Zionist if you wouldn't do that. But don't do it on the basis of scare tactics with American Jews. That led to the famous Ben-Gurion-Blaustein agreement. It was violated many times, but the principle, I think, was a very powerful one. Namely that it is perfectly appropriate for Israeli representatives to speak a language of aliyah. It is inappropriate for, in the process of their doing so, to be denigrating the internal lives of American Jews.
Is there anything more authentic about a Jewish life if that Jewish life is lived in Israel than it is if that Jewish life is lived in the diaspora?
Yes, we are both a nationality, a peoplehood, and a religion. As far as religion goes, I think it is portable. The Torah is given to the Jews in the desert. It's not given to them in the land of Israel. The promise of the Torah is exodus from Egypt to a particular land. So in that respect, I certainly would underscore the notion of the fullest Jewish life, normalization, if you will, to use a Zionist term, is the return of the Jews to sovereignty and statehood to their own homeland. Thankfully, we live in a world which has many, many choices, one of them being that of affirming a Jewish life in the diaspora. And not only do I respect the right of American Jews to do that, those are essentially the choices that I've made rightly or wrongly.
How interesting. Is there anything less authentic about a Jewish life lived in the diaspora than lived in Israel?
There is nothing less authentic. There is much to learn from our Israeli brothers and sisters.
Yeah, why didn't you say that to me? Why isn't the answer simply, no, of course there's nothing less authentic? Now I ask you.
Yes.
Can I
From
answer,
an Orthodox...
can I answer the
Yes,
question?
I should give you a... Yes.
Basically, here my convictions do run. We've had 2,000 years of aspirations of return to the Jews to Zion. Let us see the day when we do return to Zion. Today we have that option. That is a wonderful development. There's nothing more worth celebrating than that fact. And in that respect, I don't know if I'm not happy with the terms authentic, because I don't regard myself as inauthentic. But on the other hand, I certainly see the idea of normalization of the Jews as a people is in their own homeland.
I feel in some way you think it's better to live in Israel than out of Israel.
If given a choice, simply with a tabula rasa, I would say the place of a Jew is in Israel.
And then why aren't you there?
Why am I not there?
Because you're a thoughtful, good man. You're one of the most well-respected people in the Jewish community. You could find a very good job and make a good living for yourself and your family.
First of all, I have a wife. She has a view on the subject. I also have a love affair with the Red Sox. That's another reason. Between those various reasons, there are personal issues at stake.
So for you, it's not quite the same. For you, there's nothing. You're willing to say there's nothing inauthentic.
But I want to give an answer to your second question. For me, as a Jew, to live a Jewish life, as a religious Jew, I can live a better religious Jewish life, right, where I don't have kind of a religious discrimination against me outside of Israel, tragically, than in Israel.
And you can fight for it a lot more sharply where you're living there.
Yes, and not only that, the reality is that in your personal life, you would have no trouble living any kind of Jewish life you want.
In
Israel. In Israel. Any kind of Jewish life you want.
Oh, that's not
In
true.
your personal life, any kind of Jewish life you want.
We don't. Last time I checked, Jewish life is lived in community and in public.
There are
right?
many communities that you could live in Israel, which would be wholly fulfilling for you.
That is entirely untrue. The entire nature of the way in which government-sponsored religion controls fundamental religious decisions would preclude that.
How? But that would be. I'm only scared to ask you to go into it because it would take us far afield. But I am going to put an asterisk there, and I promise you, we will have a discussion specifically on that issue. We'll come back for a different program, and you'll be part of that program. I would love to discuss it.
And the aspiration, right, is that such a religious life could be lived in Israel. That is the aspiration towards which I believe world Jewry must work.
Okay. Is there anything from your perspective as an Orthodox rabbi more authentic about living a life in Israel than it is as living a life in the diaspora?
Without question.
Explain why.
Well, first of all, let me quantify. Okay, in my lifestyle, in my religion, what I believe, Zionism and religion and Judaism is one big happy package.
Of course.
I don't believe in Zionistic Jew more than I believe in a Shabbat Jew and a kosher Jew. It's a Torah Jew. And in that Torah Judaism of mine, it's all important, number one. Number two, within that context, there are many commandments of the Torah that can only be fulfilled in Israel. That is definitely a differentiation between living in New York and living in Jerusalem. So definitely, one can live that quote-unquote Jewish, which I'm making a greater pie, a better Jewish lifestyle, a more fulfilling, more Jewish lifestyle in Israel.
By the way, is there any difference between more fulfilling and better in your mind?
Hopefully not.
No, but what I mean by that is, could you argue that one has the opportunity to fulfill more mitzvot, but that doesn't make one a better Jew? Is an Israeli Jew, by definition, a better Jew in your mind?
It's very qualitative. There's an old story of one of the elder statesmen, other sages, who somebody asked him that question. And he says, I'm jealous of the bus driver, I think it's bus number 1, who drives people to the Kotel, to the Western Wall every day. Can you imagine the mitzvot and the merit he has of taking people?
There's no mitzvah to drive to the Kotel.
It's in the context of...
But you can't mislead the audience. There's no mitzvah to drive to the Western Wall.
The answer is, are we one better than the other?
Yes.
No, I will answer, am I better?
No,
the New York Pesach Lerner.
You've got a national audience listening to you right now. Are you telling our audience it's better, you're a better Jew by living in Israel?
Well, I think if one has the opportunity to fulfill more mitzvot wherever you are, if that's the case, then in a certain sense, if you can fulfill it in Israel, it's a better situation.
Are you a better Jew if you live in Israel?
I could be a better Jew if I lived in Israel.
I understand. Is by definition, living in Israel make you a better Jew?
I can't define the word better. That's up to God.
It's important. So you don't want to say better. I understand fulfilling.
All things being equal, if you put everything being equal, person A in two locations, I think he or she would be a better Jew in Israel.
And I would argue the word fulfilling is a very appropriate word. I think better doesn't apply.
Okay, I accept that.
Okay.
I do agree that any Jew would have more opportunities to be fulfilling in Israel. I agree with that.
And out of curiosity, you both choose not to live in Israel because you have a wife and you like the Red Sox.
No, I don't like the Red
Yankees.
Sox. Okay. My children and grandchildren are here. Okay. It's a better question that I have an answer for. It's definitely on my agenda. At the moment, my work is here, and I think I can accomplish a lot more. But the answer, my going is getting stronger every day.
And for you?
Well, for me, that's a good question. I came to develop my career as an actor, and I decided to stay because I felt that I could do more here as an Israeli, especially when, and this is, I was once told to go back to Israel, that I shouldn't stay here, that I'll never be an actress. So I felt that it was my job and my duty to, spread my love of Israel and explain what Israeli American culture is. So, yes.
You have any comment to what you're hearing here?
My comment is that what remains the overarching question is how we can raise up as much Judaism, right, for as many Jews everywhere in the world as we can, and build relationships around that, strengthen each other through that the unique sacrifices that people make by living in Israel are a great opportunity for Israelis to strengthen diaspora Jewry, and that the opportunity of diaspora Jews who live in a world where religion and state are separate and therefore have a variety of ways of experiencing their Judaism is a tremendous opportunity to enrich the neshamot of Israelis with a whole range of religious experiences that I think they are often not able to enjoy.
And I just want to go on record with the four of you saying that I feel it's very important that Jewish history has taught that there has been as much of a Jewish life, an exciting, thriving Jewish life that has given gifts to the entire world, and from which we, the Jewish people, have learned by living outside the land, that the diaspora experience has been at least as valid and as meaningful as living in the land. The fact that we have a Jewish state is a wonder. To use the word miracle is appropriate. And any Jew who wants to express his own Jewishness by living in the land, it's a wonderful thing to do, and I hope everybody wants to do it. But I don't ever want, I think it is almost un-Jewish to suggest that by living outside the land and then having the sense of Yiddishkeit and striving all the time to be as much of a Jew as possible, to in some way embrace Torah in one's essence, that there is something of less value, and that any Jew who does that seriously with his children and his grandchildren and his love for whatever else is going on in society is in some way shortchanging A, Jewishness, B, him or herself, or in any way the Jewish sense of God. And what I really have tried to do through Shalom TV is try to show how much richness there is in the multiplicity of Jewish life, and that at the moment we are blessed to have two centers of Jewish life, Israel and the American Jewish experience. Neither one yet is messianic in any sense. Neither one has yet reached its potential or fulfilled itself. There are problems with Israeli Jewishness, and there are tremendous problems with American Jewishness. And the four of you, in very different ways, are trying to enhance Jewish experience. And I believe the work you're doing is enhancing Jewish life. And anybody who hears you, whether they hear you in Israel, and everything you do on Shalom TV is on the internet in Israel. And those who hear you in America are enriched by what you're doing. By what you're doing, you enrich Jewish life here in America, and I believe in some way in Israel too. You enrich Jewish life extraordinarily, in extraordinary ways. You're enriching Jewish life here and the potential for all kinds of Jewish life in Israel. And if I disagree with you that you could even today live your Jewish life in Israel, that's a different discussion. But you are one of the most important voices we have in expressing what Jewishness can even become more in the state of Israel. And what you've done in a career is amazing, how you've enriched Jewish life. But you've enriched Jewish life here in America and in Israel as a result as well. And I want to be the voice that says to this audience, wherever you are expressing as much Jewishness as you possibly can, that's where the authentic, legitimate Jewish life is for you. And you shouldn't feel guilty whether you live in Manhattan, or if you live in Oshkosh, or you live in Jerusalem, or you live in the Galilee, or you live in Haifa, or you live in Paris, or you live in Rome, or you live in Barcelona. You be as Jewish as you can possibly be.
Mark, I don't think anyone here would argue with that message per se. And historically, I think you're quite correct in terms of the richness of American Jewry and its opportunities. Opportunities for Jewish education, by the way, in many ways here dwarf those in Israel by comparison. My point is a much more philosophical one, and that is that it's how the Jews have defined themselves as a people, with their homeland being in Israel, with their capital being in Jerusalem. Those are values that we have upheld for well over 2 millennia, And in that sense, again, I tend not to use the word authentic. On the contrary, I encourage Jews to lead a creative Jewish life wherever they happen to be living. But in terms of paying due notice and respect to age-old Jewish values and teachings, there is a reason why the daily prayers do talk about a return to Zion. And in that respect, I think the Zionist contribution was, perhaps it was too denigrating of diaspora experience, but it was a statement that the return of the Jews to statehood, to sovereignty, to land, to peoplehood, these represent the most exciting developments in contemporary Jewish history. It provides opportunities for Julie and her colleagues to advance the kind of Judaism that I can identify with. And in that respect, your critiques are well taken. But I wouldn't exactly want to leave it on the note that Jewish life is completely equal wherever people happen to be living.
Thank you.
There is a sense of, as a people, our homeland is the land of Israel.
Yes, and I think you're wrong.
Hoshana Haba.
I think you're.
And as we end,
and not only think you're wrong, the experience of the Jew has been to the contrary. What's interesting now is everybody who prays at the end of the Seder next year in Jerusalem has the opportunity to go down to the airport, buy a ticket, and go to Israel. You're not going, I'm not going, you're not going, you're not going, and you're not going. It's not because we're not living at an authentic expression of Jewish life. And I think the state of Israel makes only one mistake if it ever tries to say to Diaspora Jewry, if you're living in the diaspora, you're not yet Jewish enough. And that's the message you just said. And I don't think it's a message you've lived, and I don't think in general it's a message you want to teach.
You're right, it's not a message I've lived.
I think, if I may, the opportunity is out there. We're living good experiences here. We should be maximizing our Jewish experience, our education, our opportunities. But there's an opportunity that we're missing by being here, not there. And we have to at least recognize it, whether or not we can take advantage of that opportunity today or tomorrow. But I think it's important, as was said, that we have to recognize that L'Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim cannot just be 3 words that we mumble. Somewhere along the line, it has to be part of us that eventually we will be able to fulfill in our own individual ways.
And I agree that in the end, the numbers do state that there are around 1.6 million Israelis outside of Israel. And I believe that the numbers are that the population in the past year has only grown by less than 500,000. So it is a serious problem.
It is wonderful simply to be able to share ideas with the 4 of you, and it's wonderful that you would take time to be with our audience. Julie, I love having you. Steve, you're one of my dearest friends. Pesach, it's always an honor to speak with you. Sivan, it's great having you part of the team, and you were wonderful here in this discussion. I thank all of you, and I just can't wait for the next chapter. Fair enough? And that was our discussion with Steven Bayme, Director of the American Jewish Committee's Contemporary Jewish Life Department, Rabbi Julie Schonfeld, Executive Vice President of the Rabbinical Assembly, Rabbi Pesach Lerner, Executive Vice President of the National Council of Young Israel, and Sivan Hadari of Shalom TV and President of Isramerica. So what do you think? You heard these people express profound ideas. Did you find the Israeli campaign offensive? Do you sympathize with the message of the campaign? And where do you stand on where is Israel in your own life? Please share your views with us. Write me, email me, post on our Facebook wall, or tweet me. I look forward to hearing from many of you. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who can send a tax-deductible contribution of $36 or more to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media to help support our programming. Tax-deductible checks may be made out to GEM and mailed to GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. Please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD, and we thank you for your kind support.
L'chaim is a presentation of Jewish Education in Media.